civilization didn't start on Earth. It was deployed here. The oldest tablets on record state that kingship descended from heaven, not inspired, not imagined descended, as if this world was activated by an external authority. If Earth received governance, who was ruling before we ever looked up? If you're reading this in the quiet hours, wherever you are, there's something appropriate about exploring these records in stillness. The tablets themselves waited millennia in darkness before archaeologists pulled them from the ruins of Nippur, Uruk and Eridu in the late 1800s. The prism's opening presents a problem that has unsettled scholars since Henry Rawlinson first deciphered cuneiform using the Behistun inscription in Persia. Written in Sumerian, the language that predates Akkadian, Babylonian, and all later tongues of Mesopotamia, the text reads, "After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not originated in Eridu, not evolved in Eridu, descended to Eridu." The prism then lists 8 kings who ruled before a flood swept over the land. Their reign lengths are recorded in units called sars, a base 60 numerical system unique to Sumer. Alolim ruled for 8 sars, Al-Algar for 10 sars, Enmenluana for 12 sars. When converted to years, these become reigns of 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. Mainstream scholarship calls these symbolic, mythological, perhaps representing dynastic periods rather than individual rulers. The numbers follow mathematical patterns, regular increments suggesting theological composition rather than historical record. But there's something else written across thousands of cuneiform tablets, recovered from the ruins of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon and Assyria. A picture of multiplicity, of domains beyond domains, of territories described using the same administrative vocabulary found in city-state governance records, palaces, councils, jurisdictions, boundaries, resource allocation. The Sumerian cosmos wasn't abstract. It was organized. Heaven had a throne. Earth had administrators. The Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm, had a palace ruled by Enki. The underworld had gates, 7 of them, each requiring passage protocol when the goddess Inanna descended to her sister Ereshkigal's domain. These aren't vague spiritual metaphors. The texts describe geography. When Gilgamesh journeys to Utnapishtim, he travels through Mount Mashu, crosses 12 leagues of darkness, passes cosmic waters. The narrative specifies distance, direction, landmarks. When trade records document imports from Dilmun, Magan and Meluha, regions we now identify as Bahrain, Oman and the Indus Valley, mythological texts describe these same lands as falling under divine jurisdiction. Inanna is associated with Aratta in the mountains. Enki blesses Dilmun. The same gods ruling Sumer appear in narratives involving territories hundreds of miles away. What if these tablets don't describe mythology at all? What if they're administrative records, documentation of a civilization that understood reality as layered, governed and extending beyond the visible world? Not as speculation, not as fantasy, but as structure. Records of who controlled what, where resources originated, how labour was organised, which authorities held jurisdiction over which domains. This isn't a story about ancient astronauts. It's a question about how we classify texts, an investigation into whether the Sumerians were recording something we've misread, because we assumed mythology was the only category that fit. The prism sits in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum. The same clay, the same wedge marks made by a scribe's reed stylus nearly 4,000 years ago. Nothing about the object has changed, but perhaps everything about how we interpret it should. The tablets describe a cosmos divided into jurisdictions, heaven governed by Anu, earth administered by Enlil, the Abzu ruled by Enki. Distant lands integrated into divine order through trade and myth. And after the flood, according to the king list, kingship descended again, as if the system required reinstallation, as if Earth's authority was not self-sustaining but depended on external legitimacy. If that's true, then the real question isn't whether the Sumerians believed in gods. It's what they meant when they described those gods using the language of governance, territory, and administration. What were they documenting when they wrote that authority came from heaven? Not as theology, as record. Let's descend into the archive together, slowly, carefully, following the evidence wherever it leads, even if the destination reshapes every assumption we've made about how the ancient world understood its place in existence. The first barrier to understanding these texts isn't the symbols themselves. No, it's the framework we use to interpret them. For over a century, scholars have classified Sumerian god narratives as mythology, stories meant to explain natural phenomena or legitimize royal power. But what if that classification has obscured something structural? What if the consistency across thousands of tablets reveals not contradictory myths, but an organized system of cosmic governance? The answer begins with a single word pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago. The word appears again and again across different tablets, different cities, different centuries. Descended, not established, not founded, not began. The verb is directional, consistent, deliberate. When scribes in Nippur recorded the king list around 2000 BC, they opened with the same phrase their predecessors had used for generations. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then, later in the same text, after describing a catastrophic flood that swept over the land, the phrase appears again. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, twice. Before the flood, descended. After the flood, descended again. The language suggests reinstallation, as if governance required external authorization, as if Earth's political structure depended on something beyond itself. Archaeologists working in southern Mesopotamia during the 1800s unearthed thousands of administrative tablets from temple archives, grain receipts, labor assignments, field surveys, the bureaucratic infrastructure of humanity's earlier cities. But among those records were texts that didn't fit the accounting pattern. Narratives, genealogies, king lists, and the numbers didn't make sense. The well-blundled prism lists 8 rulers before the flood. Their reigns are measured in sars, a Sumerian unit based on their base 60 counting system, the same system that gave us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. 1 sar equals 3,600 years. Alulim, 8 sars. 28,800 years. Alalgar, 10 sars. 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 12 sars. 43,200 years. Scholars dismiss these as symbolic, theological exaggeration meant to elevate ancient rulers into mythic timescales. The numbers follow mathematical patterns, multiples of 60, clean increments, suggesting formulaic composition rather than historical documentation. But the text doesn't read like poetry. It reads like a record. Names, locations, reign lengths, sequence of rule, transfer of power from city to city, Eridu to Bad Tibira, to Larak, to Sippar, to Shuruppak, and then the flood, and then the phrase again, kingship descended from heaven, not restored, not rebuilt, descended, as if whatever authorized governance the first time had to authorize it again. Meanwhile, other tablets recovered from the same temple libraries describe the structure of the cosmos with the same administrative precision found in tax records and land surveys. Heaven, An, ruled by Anu. Earth, Ki, administered by Enlil. The Abzu, governed by Enki. The underworld, Kur, ruled by Ereshkigal. Each domain described with thrones, councils, gates, jurisdictional boundaries. The vocabulary is governmental, the structure is hierarchical, and Earth in this system is not the origin point. It's one layer in a multi-domain framework. If kingship descended from heaven twice, then heaven wasn't metaphor. It was location, authority, source. But what did the Sumerians mean when they described heaven as a place with administrative power over Earth? Heaven was not abstract. It had structure. The tablets describe it with the same precision they use for temple inventories and land boundaries. Gates, thrones, councils, jurisdictional authority, and heaven, ruled by Anu, the supreme authority, Ki, earth, administered by Enlil, who managed the physical realm, the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater domain, governed by Enki, described as both a physical location beneath the earth and a seat of deep knowledge. Kur, the netherworld, ruled by Ereshkigal, Inanna's sister. These weren't spiritual concepts. The texts describe infrastructure. When Inanna descends to the underworld in one of Sumer's oldest narratives, she doesn't simply travel. She passes through 7 gates. At each gate she must surrender a piece of her regalia, crown, necklace, breastplate, robe, until she arrives stripped of authority before Ereshkigal's throne. The text specifies each gate, each garment, the protocol, as if entry into another domain required permission, procedure, the removal of symbols that held power in one realm but meant nothing in another. Meanwhile, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a different journey. Gilgamesh seeks Utnapishtim, the flood survivor granted immortality, who lives beyond the edge of the known world. To reach him, Gilgamesh must pass through Mount Mashu, where scorpion beings guard the entrance. He travels 12 leagues through absolute darkness. Then he crosses the waters of death. The narrative specifies distance, direction, obstacles requiring negotiation. This is not allegory. This is route documentation. And the same administrative vocabulary appears in both mythological journeys and city-state records. Temple archives from Lagash describe land boundaries, resource distribution, labor assignments, territories governed by divine authority but managed through human bureaucracy. The god owned the land. Priests administered it. Workers cultivated it. The cosmic structure mirrored the earthly one. If heaven had councils and the tablets repeatedly reference assemblies of gods deliberating, voting, issuing decrees, then governance extended beyond earth. If the underworld had gates requiring passage through checkpoints, then movement between realms followed protocol, not metaphor. If Enki's domain, the Abzu, is described with palaces and decision-making authority separate from Enlil's jurisdiction on Earth, then these were distinct territories with defined boundaries. The texts don't contradict each other the way Greek myths often do, varying by region or poet. Sumerian records show remarkable consistency across centuries. The relationships between deities remain stable, the hierarchies hold, Anu presides, Enlil executes, Enki advises. Inanna operates across boundaries, moving between realms with apparent autonomy. But even she must submit to protocol when entering her sister's domain. Earth, in this framework, is not the centre. It's one administered region within a layered cosmos. But if Earth was only one domain among many, if kingship descended from heaven, if travel between realms required gates and permissions, if divine councils made decisions affecting multiple territories, then who governed the entire system? The texts name them, the Anunnaki. Not individually, though individual names appear throughout the records, but as a collective authority. A governing body that deliberates, votes, and issues decrees affecting multiple domains. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest complete narratives from Mesopotamia, opens with a problem that sounds strangely administrative. Before humanity existed, lesser gods performed the labor. They dug canals, they maintained rivers. They cleared irrigation channels and managed the infrastructure that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. Then they rebelled. The text describes a strike. The lesser gods burn their tools, surround Enlil's dwelling, and refuse to continue working. Enlil convenes a council. The Anunnaki deliberate. They discuss solutions. Enki proposes creating a replacement workforce. Humans, fashioned from clay and divine essence, capable of assuming the labor the lesser gods had abandoned. The council votes. Humanity is created. From a historical perspective, scholars interpret this as mythological reflection of Sumer's labour-intensive irrigation economy. The story mirrors the reality of temple-controlled agriculture, where massive workforces dug canals, built levees, and maintained water systems that required constant upkeep. But structurally, the narrative reads like bureaucratic documentation, a workforce problem, a council meeting, a proposed solution, a vote, implementation. Meanwhile, archaeological excavations at Lagash, Ur, and Nippur have recovered thousands of administrative tablets from temple archives, ration lists, labour assignments, production quotas, workers classified by task, grain processors, textile workers, canal diggers, shepherds, daily rations distributed according to labour output, measured in standard units, tracked across months and years. Temple estates described as field of the god, divine ownership with human management. The parallels are unsettling. Divine council deliberates labour policy. Temple administration implements labour policy. Gods own the land. Humans work the land. Overseers track output. The cosmos, in this framework, operates like an empire. Heaven functions as executive authority. Earth is managed territory. Humans are the labour class assigned to maintain infrastructure and produce resources. The tablets from Lagash alone document tens of thousands of workers organised into specialised teams, their productivity measured, their rations calculated based on performance. Women weaving textiles, men digging irrigation channels, children sorting grain, all of it tracked, recorded, preserved in clay. The mythological narrative and the archaeological record describe the same structure from different angles. One from the cosmic perspective, gods creating humans to solve a labour shortage. The other from the ground, humans working temple-controlled land under divine ownership. The temple economy wasn't spiritual, it was industrial. And if the Atrahasis epic reflects actual economic organisation rather than abstract theology, then humanity's role in the Sumerian worldview was never symbolic, it was functional. But if humans were created to work Earth's infrastructure, to maintain the irrigation systems and produce agricultural surplus, what exactly were they working for? They were working for the temple system, not metaphorically. The temple complexes excavated across southern Mesopotamia weren't just religious centres, they were economic engines, granaries, workshops, production facilities, and payroll hubs operating on an industrial scale. At Uruk, archaeologists uncovered storage facilities capable of holding thousands of bushels of grain. Accounting tablets tracked incoming harvests, outgoing distributions, and surplus reserves measured across seasons. At Nippur, temple archives contained over 60,000 administrative documents, ration lists, labour rosters, production quotas for textile workers, metalsmiths, bakers, brewers. At Lagash, excavations revealed workshops producing wool textiles in quantities far exceeding local consumption. The output was measured, weighed, and recorded, then traded outward through networks extending hundreds of miles. The land itself was classified in temple records as field of the god, divine ownership, human cultivation, administrative oversight. Workers weren't independent farmers. They were assigned labourers receiving standardised rations, barley oil, wool, calculated based on task, productivity and family size. The tablets specify amounts down to fractions of a litre. This wasn't worship, it was extraction. The temple controlled the land, the labour and the surplus. Priests functioned as administrators, scribes tracked inventory, overseers managed production teams. The structure resembles later imperial models, Roman provinces funneling grain to the capital, British colonial estates extracting tea, cotton, and spices through managed labour forces. But Sumer implemented this system 4,000 years earlier, and the tablets don't describe it as innovation, they describe it as inherited order, implemented after kingship descended from heaven. Meanwhile, Trade records recovered from the same temple archives document something unexpected. Goods arriving from regions far beyond Mesopotamia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, over 1,500 miles away, carnelian beads from the Indus Valley, copper from Oman, timber from Lebanon. The distances are staggering for the 3rd millennium BC, yet the tablets list these imports as routine. Annual shipments, established routes, known suppliers. Dilmun, likely modern Bahrain, appears repeatedly as a trade hub. Maritime vessels carrying goods across the Persian Gulf, overland caravans crossing mountain ranges. The temple economy wasn't isolated. It was networked, and the mythological texts describe these same distant lands using the same divine administrative framework applied to Sumer itself. Inanna's journey to Arata, a city-state in the eastern mountains, reads like a trade negotiation. She demands resources, precious metals, stones, craftsmen. The Lord of Arata initially refuses. Inanna applies pressure. Eventually, resources flow from Arata to Uruk. Enki blesses Dilmun in another text, granting it fresh water and agricultural fertility, transforming it into a productive node within a larger system. The gods don't just govern Sumer. They appear in narratives involving territories hundreds of miles away, described with the same jurisdictional language. If Earth's temple economy connected to distant lands through established trade routes, if those distant lands appear in mythological texts under divine jurisdiction, then how far did the network actually reach? It reached farther than most ancient civilizations ever did. Trade records from Sumerian temple archives document imports from regions over 1,000 miles away, distances that required crossing deserts, mountains and open seas. Dilmun, identified with modern Bahrain, appears repeatedly in economic texts as a maritime hub. Vessels carrying copper, dates, and precious stones across the Persian Gulf. The journey from Ur to Dilmun took weeks by boat, yet tablets describe it as routine commerce. Magan, the Oman Peninsula, supplied copper in massive quantities. Archaeological excavations along the Gulf Coast have uncovered Sumerian-style pottery at ancient mining sites, evidence of direct contact between Mesopotamian traders and distant resource zones. Meluha, likely the Indus Valley civilization, exported carnelian beads, ivory and exotic woods. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian cylinder seals have been found in Harappan sites. The exchange wasn't occasional, it was systematic. And then there's the lapis lazuli. This deep blue stone, prized above almost all other materials in Sumer, came from a single source. The Badakhshan mines in northeastern Afghanistan, over 1,500 miles from Uruk. The tablets don't explain how they acquired it. They simply record its arrival, its distribution, its use in temple decoration and royal regalia. 1,500 miles. Through mountains, across deserts, along trade routes that wouldn't be surpassed in scale until the Silk Road emerged millennia later. Yet the Sumerians treated these connections as established infrastructure, not extraordinary achievement. Meanwhile, mythological texts describe these same distant lands within the same divine framework that governed Sumer. When Inanna seeks resources from Arata, a city-state somewhere in the eastern highlands, the narrative reads like diplomatic correspondence. Demands are made, negotiations occur, authority is asserted, resources eventually flow from Arata to Uruk under divine sanction. Enki blesses Dilmun in another text, granting it fresh water where none existed before. The language mirrors administrative decrees found in city-state charters, jurisdictional authority extending across territories. These weren't foreign lands in the modern sense. They were integrated zones within a larger system. Sumer didn't exist in isolation. It functioned as one node in a network that stretched across the known world and possibly beyond the regions we've yet connected to their records. The temple economy managed these connections the way later empires would manage provinces. Resources flowed inward, authority radiated outward, divine jurisdiction extended across boundaries. Earth, in this model, wasn't the centre. It was one territory among many, connected through trade, myth, and administrative language. But then the texts describe an interruption, a catastrophic flood that swept over the land, destroying cities, ending dynasties, breaking the continuity of the system. The Sumerian king list marks it clearly: 8 kings before the flood. Then the flood. Then kingship descended from heaven again. If the network was this vast, if divine authority extended across territories from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf, what happened when the flood came? The flood was a systemic interruption, not divine punishment in the moral sense, not random catastrophe. The Atrahasis epic describes it as policy, a council decision made after deliberation. Humanity had multiplied. The noise of human activity disturbed the gods. Enlil convened the council. The Anunnaki debated solutions. Plague was proposed. Famine was considered. Finally a vote: send a flood to reduce the population. But Enki, who had engineered humanity's creation, found a loophole. He couldn't directly warn the human chosen for survival, a man named Atrahasis in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. So Enki spoke to a reed wall, knowing Atrahasis would overhear. Instructions were given, a boat was built, survival was ensured, the flood came, cities drowned, dynasties ended, and then, according to the Sumerian king list, governance resumed. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again, not restored from survivors, not rebuilt from remnants, descended again. The language is precise, directional, repeated. As if the flood didn't just destroy infrastructure, it broke the chain of authority. And that authority had to be reinstalled from the same external source that had granted it originally. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia reveals something unsettling. Excavations at Shuruppak, one of the 5 cities listed in the pre-flood king list, uncovered a distinct sediment layer dating to approximately 2900 BC. Clean water deposited clay, separating earlier occupation layers from later rebuilding phases. Other sites show similar evidence. Regional flooding severe enough to leave physical markers in the archaeological record. Historians interpret this as catastrophic but localized. River flooding that devastated settlements along the Euphrates but didn't cover the entire world. Yet the Sumerian texts describe it as total interruption. The flood swept over, kingship ended, then kingship descended again. The narrative structure suggests something more than natural disaster. It implies dependency. If Earth's governance required external authorization before the flood and required that same authorization again after the flood, then Earth's political structure was never autonomous. It was granted, transferred, installed, not once, but twice. The temple system rebuilt. Cities rose again. Trade routes reopened. But the king list makes clear the authority governing those cities didn't emerge from the survivors. It descended from heaven. The flood functioned as a reset. An interruption of the system followed by its deliberate reinstallation, which raises a question the tablets don't directly answer, but structurally imply. If kingship must descend from heaven to legitimize Earth's governance, if that process occurred twice, as separated by catastrophic interruption, then what exactly was heaven administering before Earth received kingship? Heaven functioned as the administrative summit, not as metaphor. The Sumerian word An carries 3 distinct but interconnected meanings: heaven as physical sky, heaven as divine realm, and Anu as the god who presides over that realm. But the texts use the same vocabulary to describe heaven's operations that they use for city-state administration. Councils, decrees, jurisdictional boundaries, transfer of authority. The structure isn't poetic, it's organizational. And at the center of this structure is a concept that appears across hundreds of tablets, spanning over 1,000 years. The me. The me are difficult to translate directly. Scholars render the term as divine decrees or fundamental powers, but the texts describe them more concretely than abstract theology suggests. The me include kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, sexual practices, legal authority, music, writing, warfare, agriculture. Over 100 distinct me are listed in various texts, and they're described as transferable. In one of Sumer's most structurally revealing narratives, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki in the Abzu. Enki, deep in his cups during a banquet, offers Inanna the me as gifts. She accepts them, loads them onto her boat, and sails back to Uruk. When Enki sobers, he realizes what he's given away, and sends servants to retrieve the me. But Inanna refuses to return them. The me remain in Uruk. The narrative doesn't describe spiritual enlightenment or symbolic transformation. It describes custody transfer. Authority moved from one location to another. Enki held the me. Then Inanna held them. The transition is documented like property exchange. The me themselves are treated as discrete units of governance, specific powers that can be possessed, transferred, stolen or withheld. Kingship is one me. Priesthood is another. Craftwork, legal judgment, military command, each a separate transferable authority. This isn't theology in the mystical sense, it's jurisdiction. And the same concept appears in city-state records. When a king claims divine authorization, tablets describe the god granting him the me of kingship. When a temple establishes authority over a territory, inscriptions record the deity bestowing the me of that region. The language parallels administrative charters, land grants, royal decrees, documents conferring legal authority from one holder to another. Meanwhile, the consistency is striking. Across centuries, from the early dynastic period through the Akkadian Empire into the Ur III dynasty and beyond, the same cosmological framework persists. Anu presides in heaven, Enlil administers earth, Enki governs the Abzu. The relationships don't shift, the hierarchies remain stable. The me continue to function as transferable units of authority. Greek mythology, by contrast, contradicts itself constantly depending on region, poet, or time period. Hesiod's version of creation differs from Homer's. Local cults describe the same gods with incompatible genealogies. Sumerian texts show remarkable structural coherence. The same divine council appears across different narratives. The same administrative vocabulary describes both cosmic and earthly governance. The same procedural language, decrees, transfers, jurisdictions, applies in heaven and on earth. This isn't mythology in the sense of imaginative storytelling that varies by teller. This is record-keeping. Documentation of a system that operated consistently enough to be described the same way across generations of scribes, cities, and dynastic periods, which introduces a disorienting possibility. We classify these texts as mythology because they describe gods. But what if genre classification has obscured function? What if the Sumerians weren't writing stories about gods? What if they were writing records about governance, and the governing authorities happen to be entities we now call gods, because we have no other category that fits? Imagine archaeologists 4,000 years from now excavating Washington, D.C. They recover documents describing Congress, the Supreme Court, executive orders. They find references to states, territories, jurisdictions. But they have no context for democratic governance. Would they classify these documents as mythology? Records of imaginary beings called senators who deliberated in a place called the Capitol? Or would they eventually recognize them as administrative archives describing a real system of organized authority? If these texts function like archives, if their consistency across centuries reflects documentation rather than imagination, have we misclassified them? Perhaps we have. The difference between mythology and administrative record isn't always content. Sometimes it's context. Greek mythology offers contradictory genealogies depending on the source. Hesiod's theogony describes one creation sequence, Orphic traditions describe another. Local cults present incompatible stories about the same deities. The myths shift with the storyteller, the region, the political climate. Sumerian texts don't behave this way. The cosmological framework remains stable across centuries. Anu presides in heaven, Enlil administers earth, Enki governs the Abzu. The relationships between deities hold constant whether the tablet was inscribed in Uruk in 2600 BC or Nippur in 1800 BC. The narratives maintain internal coherence. When Inanna descends to the underworld, the same 7 gates appear in multiple versions of the text. When the flood narrative is retold across different tablets and time periods, the core structure remains unchanged. Council deliberation, divine warning, survival through foreknowledge, reinstallation of kingship. This isn't the pattern of oral tradition evolving through retelling. This is the pattern of records being copied, preserved, and transmitted with archival fidelity. Meanwhile, the question of how we classify texts shaped the entire field of Assyriology from its inception. When Henry Rawlinson deciphered cuneiform in the mid-1800s using the trilingual Behistun inscription, he unlocked access to thousands of tablets that had been unreadable for over 15 centuries. Early scholars assumed they'd found religious texts, prayers, hymns, mythology. But as translation progressed, something unexpected emerged. Many tablets weren't religious at all. They were administrative, contracts, receipts, inventories, payroll records, the bureaucratic infrastructure of ancient cities rendered in wedge-shaped script. And buried among those administrative documents were the god narratives. Same archives, same clay, same scribal conventions. The temple libraries didn't separate religious texts from economic records. They stored them together because functionally they served overlapping purposes: documentation of divine ownership, resource allocation under divine authority, labour organisation within a cosmological framework. Scholars created the distinction. The Sumerians didn't. Which raises a classification problem that persists to this day. We call texts mythology when they describe gods. Yeah, we call them history when they describe kings. We call them economics when they describe grain distribution. But what category do we use when a single text describes divine councils making policy decisions that result in documented historical events recorded in administrative tablets? The Atrahasis epic describes the creation of humanity as a labour solution. Temple archives describe tens of thousands of workers organised under divine land ownership. Are these separate genres or two perspectives on the same system? The king list records kingship descending from heaven twice. City-state inscriptions describe kings receiving authority from gods through transfer of the me. Is one mythology and the other political propaganda, or are both documenting the same legitimization process? Consider a thought experiment. Imagine archaeologists 4 millennia from now excavating the ruins of a modern capital. They recover tax documents, legislative records, court rulings, all referencing the government, the state, federal authority. But they have no surviving context for what those terms meant. No living memory of how the system functioned. No guidebooks explaining democratic governance or constitutional law. Would they interpret Congress as a pantheon of deities? Executive orders as divine decrees? Judicial review as priestly arbitration? If the records were consistent across centuries, if the same institutional relationships appeared in document after document, would consistency indicate mythology or documentation? The Sumerian tablets present the same interpretive challenge in reverse. Consistent cosmological framework spanning over 1,000 years. Administrative vocabulary applied to both divine and earthly governance. Economic records describing labour organised under divine ownership. Narratives describing policy decisions made by divine councils with documented consequences. We call it mythology because it involves gods. But what if the Sumerians were recording structure, not fantasy? What if they documented governance, jurisdiction, resource allocation, and authority transfer across multiple domains, and we've misread those records as imaginative storytelling because the governing authorities don't fit our categories for real political entities? The tablets haven't changed. The cuneiform symbols remain the same. But the question of how we read them, whether we approach them as stories or as records, determines what we see. If the Sumerians were recording structure rather than fantasy, what does that say about Earth's place in their universe? Earth was one governed domain among many, not metaphorically, not theologically, structurally. The tablets describe a layered cosmos with defined jurisdictions, each operating under distinct authority but connected through shared governance principles. An, heaven, where Anu presided as supreme executive, the source from which kingship descended. Ki, earth, administered by Enlil, who managed the physical realm, enforced divine decrees, and oversaw the labour systems that sustained Mesopotamian civilization. The Abzu, the subterranean freshwater domain governed by Enki, described with palaces as councils and decision-making authority separate from but parallel to Earth's administration. Kur, the netherworld ruled by Ereshkigal, a realm with gates, protocols and judicial functions where the Anunnaki served as judges. And beyond these primary domains, the texts integrate distant territories, Dilmun, Magan, Meluha, Arata, into the same divine jurisdictional framework. Trade routes stretching over 1,000 miles, resources flowing from Afghanistan, Oman, the Indus Valley. Mythological narratives describing these lands under the authority of the same gods who governed Sumer. The temple economy mirrored this cosmic structure precisely. Divine ownership of land, human labour organised under priestly administration, resources extracted, processed, distributed through networks managed by temple bureaucracies that tracked every transaction in cuneiform script. Then the flood, a systemic interruption documented in both narrative texts and archaeological sediment layers. And after the flood, the reinstallation. Kingship descended from heaven again, not rebuilt from survivors, not restored from memory, descended, transferred, granted from the same external source that had authorized governance before the catastrophe. The pattern is administrative, not mythological. Authority originates in heaven, it is transferred to earth. It operates through defined channels. When interrupted, it must be reinstalled. Earth, in this framework, was never central, it was embedded. One territory within a multi-domain cosmos governed by entities the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. This isn't speculation about ancient astronauts or extraterrestrial colonization. This is what the texts actually say when read as structural documentation rather than imaginative mythology. The Sumerians didn't describe Earth as the pinnacle of creation. They described it as a managed territory within a larger ordered reality. They didn't imagine themselves alone in the universe. They imagined themselves connected, through divine authority, through trade networks, through cosmic architecture that extended beyond the visible world into realms above, below and beyond. The prism sits in Oxford, the same clay that scribes pressed into shape nearly 4,000 years ago. The same wedge marks forming the same words. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Nothing about the object has changed. The tablets recovered from Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, the same cuneiform symbols that Georgia Smith, Henry Rawlinson, and generations of Assyriologists have deciphered and translated, remain unchanged. But the question of how we classify what they're describing may need fundamental reconsideration. For over a century, we've approached these texts as mythology, imaginative stories ancient people told to explain their world, legitimize their kings, or express religious devotion. And perhaps some texts function that way. But when the same cosmological structure appears across thousands of tablets spanning over 1,000 years, when the administrative vocabulary used for divine governance matches the vocabulary used for city-state administration, when mythological narratives describe resource flows documented in economic records, when the relationships between deities remain stable across centuries while Greek myths contradict themselves constantly, then perhaps we're looking at something other than mythology. Perhaps we're looking at archives, records of a civilization that understood reality as layered, governed, and extending far beyond the boundaries of human perception. Documentation of authorities we now call gods because we have no other framework that accommodates non-human governance operating across multiple domains with transferable jurisdiction and administrative consistency. The Sumerians built the first cities, invented writing, developed mathematics, astronomy, literature, law. And when they pressed stylus to clay to record their understanding of existence, they didn't place humanity at the centre. They placed humanity in context, one species among cosmic hierarchies, one territory among many, one node in a network that stretched from heaven to earth to the Abzu to distant lands integrated through divine authority and economic exchange. Earth was not alone in their worldview, it was connected, embedded, governed. And if we've spent centuries misreading their records as mythology, when they were documenting structure, if we've dismissed their cosmology as primitive imagination, when it may have been sophisticated organizational mapping, then the question becomes unavoidable. What if the first civilization on Earth never believed it stood at the center of existence, and we are only now beginning to understand why?